Well, good. On that note, we are getting closer to our break here. We're going to give people a chance right after we get back from break to call in, those who are on our line. We've got perhaps some callers waiting to get in, so we're going to do that in just a minute. So stay tuned. Call us back. You can start calling at 248-416-1300. That's the phone line here, 248-416-1300 for the Exposing Atheism show. And we welcome your calls. Please do that. We'll be right back after this brief break. Okay, welcome back. Thanks for staying with us tonight on this show, Exposing Atheism. Before we get back into our discussion with Dr. William Lane Craig and David Wood, I want to mention a couple of quick announcements. Speaking of David, David will also be on later this evening on our show, Jesus or Muhammad, with Pastor Joseph and Sam Shamoon. That'll be on at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so make sure after this program is over, take a little break and then come on back and tune in later tonight, as well as tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. on Saturday, which again is our 5-year anniversary at ABN. So a lot of things going on here tonight and this weekend at the ministry. So I'm going to get out of the way, and if I could just, David, could you go ahead and jump in, and we'll pick up with where we left off with Dr. Lane Craig.
Yes, Dr. Craig said that the argument, the contingency argument that he just briefly reviewed, since the argument is valid, it depends on whether the premises are true, whether the statements that you're starting with in order to arrive at your conclusion, whether those are true. So if you don't have a background in argumentation, when you have an argument, you're looking for two things. You're looking for logic. In other words, the conclusion really does follow from the statements you're starting with. And second, you're looking for true premises or true statements. So you could offer all kinds of bad arguments if you start with false premises. So if I start with the claim that George Bush is the current president of the United States, and I build an argument off that, I'm going to probably arrive at a false conclusion because what I'm starting with is not true. So Dr. Craig pointed out that the logic of the argument is valid. In other words, if what he's starting with is true, then the conclusion that God exists follows. So Dr. Craig, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Yes, could you explain to us a little bit about why you believe that the statements you're starting with, your premises, are true and therefore that the conclusion follows?
All right. Well, you remember there were three premises, and the third one of these was that the universe exists. And I think that's obviously true for any sincere seeker after truth. He's not going to deny that there's a universe out there. So the question really comes down to the first two premises. Are these more plausibly true than false? Well, let's just think about them. The first one says that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. That is to say, there's an explanation why the thing exists. And this can be found either in the necessity of its own nature or else in an external cause. And I think when you reflect on this principle, it has a sort of self-evidence about it. An example that the philosopher Richard Taylor gave that I find very compelling is the illustration of someone walking through the woods and finding a translucent ball on the forest floor. He would naturally wonder why that ball came to be there. He would say there had to be some explanation of the existence of this thing. And merely increasing the size of the ball, say to the size of a car or the size of a house or the size of a continent, wouldn't do anything to either remove the need for or provide an explanation of the existence of that thing. Increasing the size of it doesn't do anything to get rid of the need for an explanation or to provide an explanation. Indeed, if you increase the size of the ball until it becomes the size of the whole universe, you're still faced with the question, why? Why does it exist? And that explanation can be found in either two factors. Either the thing exists by a necessity of its own nature. That is to say, it's impossible for it not to exist. Examples of things that exist by a necessity of their own nature might be things like numbers or sets or other mathematical objects. Many philosophers think that if these things exist, they exist by a necessity of their own nature. They don't have causes that bring them into being. They just exist necessarily. The other type of explanation would be a causal explanation. Examples would be things like people, trees, chairs, automobiles, planets, galaxies. The explanation for these things lies in an external cause for why they exist. And so it seems to me when I reflect on it that first premise has a sort of self-evidence about it, that everything that exists has an explanation why it exists, either in the necessity of its own nature or else in some external cause.
Those who are watching tonight, I mean, as I think, Doctor, of reasons why people don't believe in God, I've heard the argument, how can you look around and look at creation and look at the sky and the trees and the grass and the beauty of the water and the sunset? How can one say, and the detail in little plants and seeds and the way they happen every year, that might be one argument. How can you say that there's no creator when there's this beautiful creation that we have?
That's a very argument.
Yes, very common argument.
Based upon design or it's the beauty of creation. But here we're asking the ultimate question. What Leibniz said, the great philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz said, is the first question which should rightly be asked, and that just is the question of existence. Why does anything at all exist? This is the most basic and profound question of philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? Now, notice that first premise doesn't say anything about God. It doesn't get you to God. It just says that everything that exists has an explanation for why it exists, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. It's the second premise that gets you to God, and that premise says if the universe does have an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And this is a premise with which most atheists agree. Most atheists say that if there is no God, then the universe has no explanation of its existence. It's just a brute fact. It just exists, and there isn't any explanation. So most atheists will tell you that if atheism is true, if God does not exist, there is no explanation for the universe. Well, that's logically equivalent, you see, to saying that if God does exist, then atheism is not true. That is to say, if God does exist, then God is the explanation for the existence of the universe. So the second premise of the argument is one with which the vast majority of atheists agree. They agree with that second premise. Well, at that point, the argument is over, because then if the universe exists, it follows the universe has an explanation of its existence. And if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then God is the explanation of the universe, and therefore God exists. So I think you can see from this disarmingly simple argument, it follows that God exists. And moreover, God here is not some sort of ambiguous, ill-defined flying spaghetti monster. We're talking here about a metaphysically necessary, transcendent being beyond space and time who has brought into existence everything else that exists. So this is, I think, a very powerful argument for God's existence.
David.
Yes, Dr. Craig, let me go and raise an objection here. So you've pointed out that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in itself or in something outside of it. I agree that that seems self-evident. For those, if anyone out there kind of misses the point, it's take me, for example. I either exist on my own or something else explains why I'm here. So my parents or God creating me, something other than myself accounts for my existence. And most of the things we look around and see, something else explains those things. So this desk I'm sitting at, someone made this, someone put it together. Its existence is explained by something else. So there are only two kinds of things that exist on their own necessarily, or things that exist because something else made them. So let me go ahead and bring up an objection here. Why couldn't we say that things are explained by things that happened before them, and you just kind of go on forever? So this desk is explained by a tree being there and someone else putting the tree together in a certain way to make a desk, and that person is explained by something that happened before him, and the wood is explained by other trees producing things, and you can sort of go back and back and back just forever. You could always go to a prior explanation of why things are. So do we ever actually need to have an explanation, a necessary, something that's self-existent, something that accounts for its own existence?
It's very important to understand that the argument from contingency doesn't assume that the causal series can't go back and back to eternity. It's quite compatible with the idea that everything has a cause and it just keeps going back and back ad infinitum. What Leibniz is asking is a more fundamental question. Why is there anything rather than nothing? Why is there an eternally existing universe rather than nothing? So Leibniz isn't talking about a sort of causal series in time. He's stepping back and looking at the whole big picture and saying, why does the universe exist? And that's consistent with the universe being eternal in the past or having a beginning. That's just not germane to the argument. The question of whether the universe has a beginning is vital to the second argument that we're going to talk about, the Kalam cosmological argument. But this contingency argument is quite compatible with the universe being eternal. And what